Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar hosted by PYA. Today we are continuing our timely, tough, or tricky physician compensation and fair market value topics series with a presentation on hot topics in FMV and physician compensation to kick off your summer. PYA is happy to present today's webinar on this important topic. You will have the opportunity to submit questions to today's presenters by typing a message into the questions pane of the control panel. We'll collect these and address them via email after the webinar. And all our webinars are recorded and released with a copy of the slides after the event. With that, I would like to introduce PYA principals Lyle Oelrich and Carden. Both Lyle and Carol consult with physician practices, hospitals, healthcare systems, and other entities, including private equity, in the areas of compensation planning, fair market value compensation, and commercial reasonableness. Lyle and Carol have many years of experience in these areas, as well as in advising clients on their strategic, financial, and operational issues, such as physician recruitment.
Thank you, Trevor. A friendly welcome to each of you on this nice hot summer day. And certainly for some of you, welcome back to this timely, tough, and tricky fair market value and physician compensation webinar series. We are delighted that you're here with us today and joining us again for this series. Again, as you listen here today, and as you think about other topics that may be of interest, keep in mind that this is actually our third season. So we've covered numerous topics throughout the last 2.5 years or so. And if you have any interest in seeing those, I'll ask the moderator to chat in a link at this time to the series, and feel free to visit that website at your particular convenience. But today, as advertised, we're going to be talking about strategies and tactics to improve physician recruitment and retention while ensuring fair market value compensation. We're also going to be talking about compensating physicians for travel time. And then we're going to be talking about how you can reconcile the disparity in physician compensation offers between hospitals and health systems and private equity. And certainly the last topic is a really hot item that we've seen a lot of activity on over the last 1 to maybe 3 years. And by way of example, I think in 2019, 2020, there was a survey that was conducted by the Physician Advocacy Institute indicating that over 30,000 physicians had been acquired by PE during that time period. And for comparison purposes, there were only about 20,000 for hospitals and health systems. So really a hot topic that we're excited to talk with you here about today. And we'll go through each of these questions, we'll describe them, and certainly we'll share some of our experiences and some of how our clients are dealing with this particular issue. But finally, 2 quick logistical items to take care of before we jump right in. First, today's session is intended to be for general educational purposes only. So certainly nothing that we talk about here today is intended to issue some form of an opinion on a matter which would be based off of a particular set of facts and circumstances. And then also, second, keep in mind, we'd love to hear from you. We survey a large multitude of people at the beginning of each season to figure out what your top topics are that you'd like for us to be covering. And certainly if there's one that you'd like, we'd love to hear from you. And certainly you can always feel free to call Carol or I as well as we delve into these issues. And sometimes, like today, we may not have nearly enough time as well to cover all these items, but we'd love to talk with you at any point in time as well. So jumping right in then, let's talk about the first question that we indicated from our agenda. What are the tactics and strategies on physician recruitment and retention that we can use, that are being successfully used? And just for perspective, PYA actually conducted a poll in January of this year, and I found some of the results particularly interesting. And one that I wanted to share with you all as it relates to this particular topic is that 50% of the respondents believed that about 20% of their physicians would be leaving their organization in the next 12 to 18 months. And that just really, to me, tees up the significance of this particular topic that we're going to cover here today, because it's obviously one that many organizations are facing here. So on the slide here, and we're going to focus on this slide as it relates to recruitment, but you're going to see a word cloud, and we've done a significant amount of research to create this particular slide in the word cloud. And this is just some, but not all, of the recruitment strategies and tactics that we're seeing our clients and others use. And certainly there's a no one size fits all kind of aspect to this too, where what works in one organization may not work for another, or you may want to combine several of these as you think about how you go about recruiting your physicians on a day-to-day basis. And certainly you'll see some sort of basic items here, such as sign-on bonuses, relocation assistance. We're seeing that particularly in very high demand markets in almost nearly every offer that's made to physicians. We've also seen educational loan reimbursement being in there, a significant amount. Nearly half of the offers that we're seeing have that educational loan reimbursement. And of course, I don't want to pull away from the compensation and benefits being very competitive. Flexible schedules being a significant request by physicians, and then shared decision making. And as simple as that may sound, it's not always out there, and that's what we're hearing from the physicians as they're seeking their next job. They really want to be a part of the decision making. So creating a message around those few items, I think, is particularly important. And while I'd love to go through all of these, we just don't have time today. I do want to share perhaps just a few that we're seeing that in my mind are a little bit more creative. We're seeing sort of these channels for physician recruitment beginning earlier and earlier in a physician's career. I think a few years ago, we probably would have seen that kind of in the college ranks. But now it's going back to even the high school years, where juniors and seniors are being connected, and we're trying to make sure if they want to be in the community, they're aware of a particular healthcare institution. So it's just really getting a lot earlier. On the topic of starting earlier as well, we're seeing these sign-on bonuses get paid earlier and earlier. Some of them are being paid when these physicians are back in their fellowships. Of course, you want to make sure it's structured properly, so you have a clawback in the event something occurs, something like that. But going out and meeting these individuals much more earlier, I think, is a theme that we're seeing here. Of course, continuing to attract physician dependents, recruiting spouses is always one that people don't always think of, but they are particularly informative as it relates to decision making. Perhaps it's tuition reimbursement for a physician's son or daughter. So those are some things that we're seeing out there. And on top of that, one of the things that we're seeing is more and more recruitment is going outside of an institution's local market. So whereas you may be in a market with 2 or 3 competitors and you're used to competing with those, we're seeing more and more entities go outside of that local market to find their next physician to fill a particular role. On this slide, we wanted to talk for just a moment about physician retention. And I really, really like this slide. It's a study that was conducted by MGMA and the Jackson Research Group. But as you look at it, what's informative to me is it really talks about residents and fellows and what's important to them in their first position. And then it also goes on to talk about why physicians leave or why they stay. And so there's tons of information here. Again, the slides are available to everybody, so you can take your time walking through this. Just a couple that I wanted to walk through real quickly that caught my eye as I was looking at this. APP clinical support staff is one. Sometimes physicians earlier in their career don't realize how much help they may need going through a day in and day out basis, but they certainly do as they get older. And so while there's a small tick up there, in our experience, it's even more sort of emphatic as it relates to being able to provide those resources to the physicians. Comp, of course, is always going to be on the list. Very important to residents and fellows, not as important to the physicians as to why they leave or stay. But then the practice ownership model as well. You'll see a significant increase there on why physicians leave organizations, and we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about that. For comparison purposes, I mentioned that PYA did some surveys earlier in this year, another poll that we conducted on physician retention issues. The top 5 that came back from our poll was call coverage, productivity pressure, work-life balance, charting, and staffing issues. And so you'll see several there. The flexibility concept that I talked a little bit earlier, kind of matching up with the work-life balance. Again, the staffing issues. Charting wasn't necessarily on this particular survey that was done by MGMA and Jackson Research, but that's certainly one that we're hearing about, being able to respond to those pressures and that particular, I guess, administrative burden is something that's significant to these physicians as well. So with that being said, I'm going to pause for just a moment, hand it over to Carol, and she's going to talk about our second question.
Thanks, Lyle. So our second question, get the slides to go, whoops, too far. How do you compensate physicians for travel time? So we all know it's not unusual that physicians might provide their services in more than one location. We don't usually see this question posed if they're driving across town, 5 miles and covering a different clinic location, but we do see it posed frequently if they're covering an outlying clinic. So hospital system that might have some like rural outreach. And so the question becomes, well, if you're going to pay them for that travel time, what's the right rate to pay that at? And from the physician's perspective, they're usually thinking of it more in terms of opportunity costs. So I'm not in my clinic seeing patients now. If I were, I could be generating X amount of collections or work RVUs per hour, and they want to be paid under that kind of methodology. So unfortunately, the benchmark data that we subscribe to doesn't really report travel time rates, right? It reports clinical compensation, it reports administrative compensation. Travel time doesn't really fall squarely into either one of those, but probably has more features and characteristics more similar to administrative compensation. So there's several different ways we see clients address this. If you already have some employed physicians who are being compensated for travel, then that's certainly one place to look, because consistency in a rate like this is not a bad thing, right? So that's one thing you could do. If you have seen it addressed in a litigation context, that's always something to take a look at too. So did this become an issue in a litigation case? And if so, what was the conclusion on the right rate to pay? But what we typically see proposed, or a question asked to us, is paying it at 50%. 50% of what is then the question. So 50% of an administrative rate of pay, or 50% of a clinical rate of pay. So if you're going to pay it on a clinical rate of pay, we just would remind you that there's some very specific language in the Stark regulations that say clinical rates of pay for clinical work, administrative rates of pay for administrative work. Like I mentioned earlier, this probably has features a little more similar to administrative, that there could be specific facts and circumstances that you're dealing with that make 50% of a clinical rate of pay completely appropriate. We would just encourage you to document that really well, and contemporaneously as to when you're entering into it, what your thought process was, and establishing that. The other way we've seen some clients handle it is through work RVU proxy. So basically, take a study for that particular specialty, maybe how many work RVUs per hour are generally generated, And for each hour of travel time, give a proxy work RVU. That, of course, is mimicking more the clinical rate of pay. So if you're going to use a methodology like that, again, you would want to document why that's the appropriate way to do it. And then the other way that we've seen it handled is through a study of time value units. So if we think about work RVUs, those are established by CMS. Those are not really intended to be time-based measurements. They're more a measure of intensity, complexity of patient care, as compared to time value units, which are a study done more specific to that actual practice. So that practice studying what are the different types of generally administrative work. So work RVUs based on clinical effort, time value units more based on administrative effort. And we usually see this done in regards to like leadership of the practice or educating and mentoring new clinicians or marketing the practice. So that's another possible way to handle the travel time issue. And then what we have on this slide is just some things that to think about if you're going to pay a physician for travel time. First and foremost, you want to make sure that it wasn't already contemplated in the base compensation. So when this physician was being recruited, was there already a provision made in how the base was established to recognize that the physician would spend some amount of time travel? Because if that is the case, then you don't want to then pay a travel rate over and above that, because you'd be paying twice for the same effort. We also want to think about the physician's FTE status. So obviously a physician who's spending 40 plus hours already in a clinic and then traveling over and above that is probably a little bit stronger, more defensible argument than someone who's maybe only doing 30 hours, and this travel time kind of becomes part of what gets this person to a full-time status. We also want to think about, when is the travel happening? So is it happening in a time that it's taking the physician otherwise out of the clinic? And this is kind of a two-sided argument, because if it's taking them out of the clinic, that's where the physicians usually come from, the opportunity cost. But if they're doing it after hours, that's also burdensome, right? So you just want to make sure that you have a good understanding and document when the travel is happening and how that factors into your rate that you're determining. And then the final thing that we want to think through is the physician getting some other recognition of this travel effort through work review credit or already a stipend, kind of along the same lines of understanding how the base compensation was determined. You want to make sure that there's not another mechanism already in place to compensate the physician for travel before you enter into a separate rate for the travel time. So those are the things that we generally see in regards to travel time. Then our third question: how do you reconcile the apparent disparity in physician compensation offers between health systems and private equity? So for simplicity and in the interest of time for this presentation, we're going to talk about these differences in regards to private equity, but also recognizing that in some markets, the payers are also heavily involved in transactions and in acquiring physician practices. And in some regards, the way the payers tend to structure their offer also mimics more how private equity tends to structure their offers. So for simplicity, like I said, the examples we're going to talk about here, we're going to use private equity as our reference point. So we just did a really super simple example here. What we generally see is if the term sheet's coming from a health system, you might have a lower upfront purchase price, but then compensation might be equivalent to what you had in private practice, sometimes even maybe a little bit more because you may be taking on some additional responsibilities. As compared to what we typically see when we see like a private equity offer is they might have a much larger upfront purchase price, but a smaller salary offer going forward. Now, there can be, legitimate reasons for why these are different, but one thing that's very important to understand and to help the physicians navigate, because usually when this question comes to us, it's coming from a health system who's saying, how do we compete? Because the physicians see the big upfront purchase price and it's like, dollar signs, and may get really interested in that. So it's very important to understand where the physicians are. And it may be where the whole group is, or it may be where individual physicians within the group are. Because physicians who are older and maybe nearing retirement, it might be more attractive to them to have the big upfront payment They're not as concerned about the level of compensation going forward because they know they won't be working that many more years, as compared to younger physicians who might still be servicing medical school debt, have younger families. They're more interested in the higher compensation amount going forward. So it's very important to really have a good understanding of where the physician's motivations are coming from when they're evaluating competing offers like this. So we did just a quick little hypothetical here, and we've actually done this for several clients who were in this situation. So we did a comparison of what's the total amount of cash coming to the physicians in terms of purchase price and ongoing compensation over a 7-year period between the two offers. So even though they're structured very differently, what at the end of the day, how much total cash over a 7-year period? And basically they were pretty equivalent. They were $5,000 off on a $6 million total package. And reasons for that, some of the reasons for that, the reasons that the private equity many times will come with a larger upfront offer. If you think about what their motivations are, they're usually rolling up practices onto a platform. So there's going to be some economies of scale there. They might be generating management revenue in a separate entity that they're going to take into consideration. And the compensation difference that I mentioned is also part of that calculus there. But they may have a higher appetite for a multiple than maybe a health system does, because they also don't have the same regulatory constraints that health systems do. And here in a moment, Lyle's going to talk about, do all of those differences make that offer fair market value or not consistent with fair market value? So Lyle, let me turn it over because that's an important thing for our audience to really think through. So let me turn that over to you to talk about that.
Yeah, as we transition into that for the audience, of course, I think when you think about fair market value from a Stark perspective, notably, you really have to think about the buyer and the seller. And it's really important from our perspective that when we're doing it, we're putting ourselves in the shoes of each individual so that we can see all sides of the equation here. And, PEs are coming together, they're focusing on scale, they're focusing on efficiencies. They're generally in it for short-term periods. I mean, I think we're seeing something in our example here that we have on the slide here. It's 7 years, but we've seen sort of as short as 3 years. And so they're really kind of coming in, getting into it, trying to effectuate some changes, either on the revenue side or on the expense side. And then they're often exiting the market. And a lot of times that can be to another private equity firm. And so that's just a unique set of facts and circumstances that you need to think about. Now, on the hospital side, if you're thinking about employment, the hospitals are typically focused on meeting community need. They've performed some sort of physician supply and demand study, and they know that they need a certain number of, let's say, family practice physicians in their communities to meet the need. And so they're thinking much more long-term about some of these. And so that just kind of gives you some flair for where these offers are coming from, what they're trying to incentivize. But certainly, it's often referred to as the haircut, which is this lower amount of compensation that's being paid after the transaction begins in the PE world, after they've got sort of a larger upfront purchase price. But in this case, and this isn't too far off from a particular actual example that we've helped a client with, it is a $5,000 over roughly $6 million. Now that's before accounting for the time value of money as well. So that's an important aspect not to forget here. But just a few more thoughts on private equity offers and fair market value. First, some people aren't aware that we have some reference to this in the Stark law that went final and effective January 19th of 2021. And there's a quote here: a hospital may not value a physician's services at a higher rate than a private equity investor or another physician practice. Put another way, the value of a physician's services should be the same regardless of the identity of the purchaser of those surveys. And so I wanted to maybe break that down a little bit for this group as we talk about it here today. And fair market value then from a Stark law perspective is not what can be referred to as strategic or investment value. And so sometimes you'll hear those terms when you're talking with valuators and the like. They are not the same. When you talk about strategic or investment value, and that's often what PE uses to come up with their offers when they're able to, it talks about how that firm believes that they can effectuate some component of the revenue or some component of the expenses where they see more value perhaps than what others in the market may see. And that's where we have to be careful from a fair market value, because we have to be thinking about all of the willing buyers and sellers and can they effectuate those same changes. Sometimes they can. If a practice is being mismanaged, for example, and we can expect any willing buyer to be able to fix those management issues, we can model that out from a valuation perspective and give that due consideration, but not all of them can. And then likewise, one of the things that we're encouraging, our clients to be thinking about too is when you're looking at market data. And so for those of you all that are familiar with the various physician compensation and productivity surveys that are out there, we need to be thinking about, as the PE firms continue to have more and more presence overall as it relates to the number of physicians that they employ, if they are reporting that data to these benchmark surveys and they're following the similar example that we used before, and the physicians are experiencing these haircuts, so to speak, depending on how you're structuring your deal, some of that benchmark data may be artificially lower than it would have been if these deals would have been structured the way that they have been historically. And so that's really important as you're using these surveys to understand what data is going into them. Certainly, if you can give some consideration to perhaps the percentage of PE that might be in that respondent population, it's really, really important to get into the weeds as you use that data or any data set. And so, finally, again, putting yourself in the buyer and the seller situation here, there are pros and cons to every type of transaction, but often we hear our clients saying, well, what does this look like in 3 to 7 years? Where are we going to be? And giving that consideration into what you're willing to pay for or accept from a value perspective. And then also what type of strain might be created by a particular transaction coming together. By way of example, and this is solely just an example, we had one client who was dealing with the physician. It was a hospital client that was dealing with a physician practice entertaining PE ownership. Literally say, if you go on board with that PE firm, we are going to recruit our own specialist in your specialty and directly compete with you. So all of these things, they're fair market value, but some of them are business and advisory as well. It's just really important to stop and put yourselves in the shoes of each of those particular individuals and think through how these deals need to come together, both from a commercial reasonableness perspective, a volume or value of referrals perspective, and certainly a fair market value perspective. So with that being said, I'm going to ask our moderator to close us out, and we thank everybody for joining us here today.
Thanks to our presenters, Lyle and Carol. If you have any questions, their presentation and contact information will be emailed to you, along with a recording of today's webinar. Also, if PYA can provide assistance with audit, tax, compliance, valuation, or physician services, call or email us. You may also visit our website at pyapc.com for more details about our specific areas of expertise or to subscribe to receive PYA insights. On behalf of PYA, thank you for joining us and have a great rest of your day.